There is a photograph taken in the autumn of the year she turned 61, and in it, Vera Castleberry is standing in a pen of red dust with her back to the camera and her right hand resting on the neck of a bull that comes up to her shoulder. The bull is not pretty. His hip bones jut like fence posts beneath a hide the color of old brick, and his head is enormous and low-slung, the way a head looks when the skull is dense all the way through. He is watching something in the middle distance with the flat, patient attention of a creature that has no interest in hurry. She is watching the same thing. Neither of them looks like they are waiting for anything, because neither of them is. They have already done the thing. The photograph is framed behind glass in the office of the Territorial Livestock Association in a town 200 miles north of where Vera lives, and below it, on a small brass plate, someone has engraved the sentence she told a reporter when the reporter asked her what she had learned. The sentence reads, "The bones you bury are the ones that grow back." She did not mean it as a riddle. She meant it as a fact about genetics and about patience, and about the way a bloodline can sleep inside an animal for 4 decades and then wake up and walk out of a pen and change every calculation a person thought was settled. This is the story of how that happened. In the spring of the year she turned 53, Vera Castleberry drove 4 hours southeast on a state highway with a borrowed trailer and a personal check for $11,000 to look at what was left of the Aldecoa cattle. She had read about them in a registry bulletin, so old that the paper had gone amber at the edges, and the staple had left a rust shadow on the cover page. The bulletin was from a livestock association that no longer existed, printed in the decade before she was born, and it described the Aldecoa line in 2 paragraphs of plain technical prose as a compact, dual-purpose breed developed over 3 generations by a family of Basque-descended ranchers on the dry limestone plateau of the hill country. Animals selected hard for heat tolerance, parasite resistance, efficient feed conversion, and what the bulletin called structural longevity, meaning bones and joints that stayed sound past the age at which most cattle become a liability. The bulletin noted that the Aldecoa animals carried a combination of traits so thoroughly fixed by selective breeding that they bred true in almost every cross, meaning the good qualities came through in the offspring reliably, not occasionally. The bulletin then moved on to other topics. The line was not discussed again in any document Vera had ever found. She had found 3 other references to the Aldecoa name in 30 years of quiet searching. One was a single line in a deceased rancher's estate inventory from the 1970s, listing Aldecoa-type bulls among property sold at auction to unknown buyers. One was a handwritten note tucked inside the cover of a veterinary handbook she bought at an estate sale, reading only fine-boned calves do not say small, Aldecoa. The third was a conversation with a 92-year-old woman named Priscilla Rueda, who had grown up near the original family's range and who told Vera over coffee on a Tuesday afternoon that those cattle could go 3 days in August without shade and never drop weight, and you never lost a calf to joint trouble, not once, and that the family had dispersed the herd during a collapse of beef prices in the early 1980s, and that she believed some of the genetics had ended up with a man named Odell Fuentes, who ran a small operation on leased land near a town called Persimmon Creek, and who had not, to Priscilla's knowledge, ever sold anything to anybody in the last 40 years. Odell Fuentes was 81 years old when Vera arrived. He met her at the gate in a pair of canvas trousers and boots that had been resoled so many times the leather of the upper and the rubber of the sole were no longer from the same century, He shook her hand and looked at her face for a moment, and then turned and walked toward the pens without speaking, which Vera took as an invitation. There were 7 bulls. She counted them twice. 7. The youngest was 4 years old. The oldest was 11, and they had been bred to a small remaining herd of cows that Odell had been maintaining for decades, on a combination of native grass, stubborn habit, and an almost total indifference to the opinion of the outside world. The bulls were not large. A first-time viewer would have called them undersized. She stood at the rail for 40 minutes. She watched them move. She watched the way the youngest one stood on a rock outcropping at the edge of the pen, not fidgeting, simply standing, his feet placed with a quiet precision that told her something about his joints. She looked at the 11-year-old and noted that he moved without stiffness. She noted the condition of their hooves. She noted the slick, dense quality of their coats. She wrote a check for $9,000 for 3 of the bulls and gave Odell a handwritten agreement that she would return the following spring to purchase 2 more at the same price per animal, and that she intended to acquire the remaining 2 bulls or their direct sons within 3 years. The agreement was legally unenforceable, but neither of them mentioned that. Odell held the check for a moment and then folded it and put it in the pocket of his canvas trousers. He said, "They do not need much." She said, "I know." He said, "Most people need something that needs a lot, so they know they are doing something." She said nothing to that. She loaded the 3 bulls into the borrowed trailer in the late afternoon light and drove 4 hours home in the dark. She was told she was wrong about the bulls many times in the years that followed, and the telling took many forms, some of them well-intentioned, which was its own kind of difficulty. The first time was in August of that first year, when the regional extension agent, a large-framed man named Davis Pruitt, who wore his institutional confidence the way some men wear cologne, came out to her place to discuss a grant program for herd improvement and stood at her fence, looking at her Aldecoa bulls with an expression of careful pity he did not entirely conceal. He said, "Vera, with respect, I have run the numbers on dual-purpose breeds in this county's climate conditions, and I have not seen one perform above the second quartile in a decade of data." She said, "These are not those breeds." He said he understood that she was working from an attachment to an old idea, and that he had seen this before in operations that had been in a family for generations, and that the emotional dimension of ranching decisions was something he was always sensitive to. She said, "These bulls are not a memory." He said the grant money was available and the approved sires were available, and he could have the paperwork to her by Friday. She thanked him and walked back to the pen, and he stood at the fence a moment longer and then drove away in his truck. And she did not call on Friday, and he did not follow up. The second time was at the feed store that October, when her neighbor Gus Treadwell told everyone in the store that Vera Castleberry had spent her savings on 7 old, ugly bulls that didn't have papers and looked like someone had left them in the sun too long, and that he had heard she had turned down the extension money, which was free money, practically free money, and that he felt genuinely sorry for her. He said this last part loudly enough that she heard it from the next aisle. She came around the corner with a bag of mineral supplement and set it on the counter and said, "Not 7, 3, and then 2 more in spring." He said that was worse. She paid for her mineral and left. The third time was in the spring of the following year, when a cattle buyer named Leonard Reese came through the county and stopped at her place because he stopped at every place, and because he had heard she was running something unusual. He walked her pens for 20 minutes and then stood with his thumbs in his belt and told her, in a voice that was almost gentle, that what she had was a conservation project, not a commercial enterprise, and that if she wanted to preserve a piece of livestock heritage that was a fine and worthy thing to do, but that the market had moved on, and nobody was buying small-framed, dual-purpose cattle for range work when there were purpose-built genetics available that simply outperformed on every metric he could name. He named 5 metrics. She listened to all 5. Then she said, "What is your cost per pound of gain on those genetics in a dry year?" He looked at her for a moment. She said, "Not the brochure number, the dry year number." He said the data was variable. She said, "Yes, it is." He got in his truck and drove to Gus Treadwell's place and told Gus that Vera was a hard woman who had made a sentimental choice and was too proud to admit it, and Gus agreed, and they had coffee. She had, by then, located the source she had been working from. It was not a journal. It was 3 composition notebooks and a stack of loose pages held together with a rubber band, all of it belonging to a man named Francisco Aldecoa, who had died in 1978, and whose granddaughter, a woman named Solis, who lived in San Antonio and had no interest in cattle, had given the notebooks to Vera for the cost of postage after Vera had written her a letter explaining what she was trying to do. Francisco Aldecoa had kept records of every breeding decision he made over 31 years. He recorded birth weights, weaning weights, coat condition scores, parasite counts done by a method he described precisely, structural assessments of legs and feet, age at which each animal showed its first signs of physical decline, and the performance of every cross he made. He had written in the margins in a hand that grew smaller and more compressed with age, making notes to himself about what he expected versus what occurred. He had been wrong sometimes, and he had noted that too. He had a notation system for heat tolerance observations made during specific temperature and humidity combinations, and a separate notation for cattle that maintained weight on native grass alone in years when his records showed below-average rainfall. In the back of the 3rd notebook, he had written a single page of conclusions in English instead of his usual Spanish, as though he were writing them for someone he had not yet met. The conclusions were numbered 1 through 9. Vera had read them the night the package arrived, sitting at her kitchen table with a glass of water and a pencil. She had underlined 4 of the 9. She read those 4 again. She set the notebook down. She went outside and stood in the dark for a moment, and the oldest of her 3 bulls was at the fence, and she could see his shape in the dark by the pale stripe on his forehead. She said quietly to no one in particular, and also to him, "There you are." The years between that night and the summer of the crisis were not dramatic. This is the part that gets left out of most accounts, and it is the part that matters most, because the years were the method. The bulls were doing work that no one could see, or that no one was looking for. She had taken the 3 original bulls and bred them to a small herd of grade cows she had been running for 12 years, selecting the herd females carefully for the same traits Francisco Aldecoa had described: structural soundness, parasite resilience, the ability to hold condition without supplemental feed in dry stretches. In the first generation, she culled heavily, keeping only the replacements whose records matched Aldecoa's criteria. In the second generation, she culled again. She was not trying to make a lot of cattle. She was trying to make the right cattle. The 2 additional bulls she had purchased from Odell Fuentes in the spring following her first visit had deepened the breeding pool. The 7th bull, a young son of the 11-year-old, she had acquired from Odell in the 3rd year of their arrangement for a price that she paid without hesitation, and that was, by any measure of commercial cattle genetics, absurdly low. By the 8th year, She had 61 cows of her own breeding and 7 active bulls, and a weaning weight average that she wrote in her record book and did not share with anyone, because she had learned that sharing numbers invites argument, and argument takes time she did not have. She did share them with one person. His name was Aurelio Solis, and he was the grandson of Francisco Aldecoa's sister, which made him a collateral heir of the records she carried. He had come to her place in the 4th year, driving a truck with a cracked windshield, and no explanation for how he had found her, and he had stood at the fence of her main pen for a long time without speaking. Then he had said, "The hip angle is right." She had said, "Yes, it is." He had said, "Grandfather wrote that you can read 40 years of selection in the hip angle if you know what you are looking for." She had said, "I know, I read it." He had stood there a moment longer, and then he had said, "Do you need help?" She had said, "Yes." He had said, "I do not know ranching." She had said, "You know the records." He had said, "I know the records." He had driven back the next morning with his tools and a change of clothes, and he had been there, more days than not, for the 8 years that followed. He was 34 years old. He was not a talker. They worked well together. The summer the crisis came had been preceded by 2 years of drought that the county had named and categorized and discussed at length without quite believing in, the way people discuss a thing that is happening to them as though it were happening somewhere else. The groundwater was down. The supplemental hay market had pushed costs to a level that reduced margins to near nothing for anyone running cattle that required high inputs. Gus Treadwell had taken a line of credit in March to cover feed costs. Davis Pruitt had issued 2 advisories about herd reduction as a strategy and was preparing a third. Leonard Reese had been through the county twice in the spring alone, buying animals at distress prices from ranchers who could no longer carry them. This was the condition of things in July when the fever came. It was a tick-borne disease, vectored by a species that had been extending its range northward for several years, through territory that had been historically too cold for it to survive the winter, but that was no longer quite cold enough. The state veterinary authority issued the first advisory on a Wednesday. By the following Wednesday, the advisory had become a confirmed outbreak notification, covering 4 counties, and by the end of that month, the quarantine boundary had been drawn, and the word most often used at the feed store and on the county road and at the gate of every affected place was catastrophic, which was the correct word. The fever was treatable. It was not uniformly fatal, but it required an animal to have something in reserve, something metabolic and immunological and structural, when the fever spiked and the body began the work of fighting it back. Cattle that were already in compromised condition from 2 years of drought and high-cost feed and the low-level chronic stress of nutritional deficit did not have that reserve. The fever found them with nothing left. Operations that had spent the previous 8 years running animals that needed a lot, as Odell had said, were running animals that now had nothing left to give. The mortality on Gus Treadwell's place reached 31% before the fever broke. Leonard Reese's own holding operation, 40 miles south, lost 22% of its inventory in 6 weeks. Davis Pruitt wrote a final advisory in September that was really an autopsy, a document explaining in careful institutional language how the economic logic of the past decade had stripped the buffer from the herd genetics of the region and left them unable to absorb a shock that a more resilient animal could have survived. He did not name any particular animal in the advisory. He did not name any particular person. Vera lost 4 animals. Of her 61 cows and 7 bulls, 4 died. The four were the oldest, animals she had carried past their productive years for reasons that were not strictly economic, and their deaths were not the fever's victory so much as their own bodies' long and patient conclusion. The bulls were untouched. The replacement heifers and the cowherd came through the fever with a clinical trajectory that the veterinarian who attended her place, a woman named Torres who had been practicing in the county for 15 years, documented in notes she later shared, with Vera's permission, at a regional livestock health conference. Dr. Torres wrote in those notes that the Castleberry cattle showed parasite-mediated resilience, consistent with a breed population that had been under long-term selection pressure for immune function, and that the fever's progression in these animals differed measurably from its progression in the general county population, and that the difference was not small. Gus Treadwell drove over on a Tuesday morning in October, 3 weeks after the quarantine was lifted. He came in his truck and he parked it at the gate, and he sat in it for a moment before he got out, which she watched through the kitchen window. She went outside. He walked to the fence and stood looking at the cowherd in the near pasture. He did not say anything for a while. She stood beside him. Then he said, "I lost 31. She said, "I know." He said, "How did you?" She said, "The genetics." He said, "The ugly bulls." She said, "Yes." He was quiet. Then he said, "I have 22 cows that survived, and I need a bull." She said, "I know." He said, "What is your price?" She told him a price that was a fair price, which is to say it was a price that was not a revenge price and not a charity price, a price that a person could look at from any direction and call fair. And he stood there for a moment, absorbing that. And then he nodded. He did not say, "Thank you." She did not require it. Within 8 weeks of the quarantine lifting, she had fielded 41 inquiries from ranchers in 6 counties. She answered every one of them in writing and in full. She explained the breeding history. She explained Francisco Aldecoa's selection criteria and gave the page numbers in the notebooks. She set a price for the bulls and for the bull calves, and she wrote a plain, 1-page document describing the traits she had selected for and the traits she expected to breed true in crosses with existing regional cattle. She did not oversell. She wrote what she knew, and she wrote where the uncertainty was. She sold 11 bulls in the first year after the fever, and 14 in the second year, and she retained enough of her own herd to continue deepening the breeding program, and enough of the original bloodline documentation that every buyer received a copy of the relevant pages from Francisco Aldecoa's third notebook, the one with the conclusions written in English, along with a note from Vera that said, "These numbers are what he found. Your numbers will be different. Write them down." Aurelio built a copying machine for the notebooks. He photographed each page and made archival prints. He cataloged the loose pages. He cross-referenced Francisco's notation system with the veterinary literature that now, 4 decades later, gave scientific names to the traits the old man had described in plain-spoken field language. He built a database. He presented the database at the same livestock health conference where Dr. Torres had presented her notes, and the 2 presentations were scheduled back-to-back, which no one had planned, and which turned out to be one of those small accidents that look, in retrospect, like design. Davis Pruitt was at that conference. He sat in the 3rd row. He listened to both presentations. He did not look at Vera during his own, a closing summary he had been scheduled to give for several months. Afterward, in the hallway, he stopped beside her and said, "I was wrong about the line." She said, "Yes." He said, "I am sorry I did not look more carefully." She said, "The numbers were not available to you." He said, "I should have looked for them." She said, "Yes." They stood there a moment. He said, "Will you let me cite the Torres notes in the revised advisory I am writing?" She said, "Yes," he said. "And the Aldecoa records?" She said, "Yes, cite Aurelio. He is the one who organized them." Pruitt nodded. He started to say something else, and then did not, and she did not press him to, and they went in different directions. She turned 67 in the third spring after the fever. Her herd had grown to 94 cows. Aurelio had his own small breeding operation on land he had leased 2 miles east, running a subset of the line in a separate program that complemented hers. Odell Fuentes had died at 85 in the second year after the fever, quietly in his house near Persimmon Creek, and Vera had driven down for the funeral with Aurelio and stood in the back of a small church and felt the particular weight of knowing that a man had kept a thing alive for 40 years when every signal of the world told him to let it go, and that the keeping had mattered, and that he had not lived to see the full shape of what his keeping had made possible, but that he had known the shape was there. She had not cried at the funeral. She had held the image of him folding her check and putting it in his pocket, and she had thought, he knew. He already knew. The Territorial Livestock Association mounted the photograph in its office in the 4th year. They asked her to write something for the plaque. She sent them a sentence and told them to use it as is or not at all. They used it as is. There are ranchers in those 6 counties now who keep their own records in composition notebooks. Some of them because she told them to, and some of them because their neighbors do. And they have begun to understand that the record is not a formality. It is the thing. A 23-year-old woman from the county, 2 hours east, drove out to Vera's place last spring with a question about weaning weight variance in second-generation crosses, and Vera gave her coffee and sat with her at the kitchen table and answered the question from memory, and then gave her the photocopied pages with the relevant numbers circled. The young woman asked how long it had taken to get the line to where it was. Vera said, 40 years before me and 15 since. The young woman said, so 55 years. Vera said, yes. The young woman sat with that. Then she said, I am 23. Vera said, then you have time. Start the book. The oldest surviving bull is 9 years old now, a great-grandson of the one in the photograph, and he stands in the near pasture most evenings in the same attitude as his ancestor, head low, watching the middle distance with the flat and patient attention of a creature that has no interest in hurry. He does not know what he carries. That is not his job. His job is to stand there and be sound and pass the soundness forward, which he does morning after morning, season after season, without complaint and without drama, in the long and quiet work that no one sees until the moment when everyone needs what it made. The bones you bury are the ones that grow back. She did not mean it as a riddle.